Keep the Acid Horizon podcast ad-free by subscribing to our Patreon.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. So, on the day that Donald Trump won for a second time, there's of course a big time delay being in the UK. I woke up, saw the results and said, yeah, fair enough. Walked myself directly down to Houseman's and I bought this book. Because I thought, okay, yeah, fair enough. We need to start cracking into the libidinal economy of contemporary fascism or its pre-fascist sites of emergence. And today, we are overjoyed to have with us Richard Seymour, the author of Disaster Nationalism, as well as, of course, The Disenchanted Earth and, of course, The Twittering Machine. Richard, thank you for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I just want to start off with one of the ways in which you frame disaster nationalism as opposed to just going straight in with say that this is a resurgence of fascism. Of course, it is a resurgence, but some of the things you point out is it's not quite a resurgence in the sense of the historical experience of fascism as a mass movement. It's more intertwined with aspects of spectacle, with the social industries, as you call them, with social media dissemination, and spreads in a way with a kind of more of a celebrity, more of a virality than the traditional experience of fascism would allow us to fit into a neat kind of historical box. So could we unpack this idea of disaster nationalism and the way it spreads in this kind of social contagion model, and indeed its possible limits where you try to tackle that in the book?
Right. So the first thing is there's a fairly parochial debate, especially in America, but I think spreading into Europe as well, about fascism. And it tends to conflate fascism with undemocratic government or, top-down tyranny, that kind of thing. And it then segues into various conversations about white privilege, economic anxiety, status anxiety. All of these things, I think, are of extremely limited explanatory value. I do think there is an incipient or inchoate fascism taking place here, but it is not in the form of specific governments. You look at the governments that are elected in India, in the Philippines, in Brazil, in the United States, Hungary, Israel, wherever you look, they have not attempted to overthrow parliamentary democracy or the institutions of the rule of law or republic. What they have instead attempted is something more like a constitutional rupture, tilting the balance of forces rather sharply in the direction of authoritarian reaction and ethnic exclusions of various kinds. So where does fascism come into this? To me, fascism begins in the first place as something that percolates in the population. It's a series of potentials that are fizzing away and never entirely gone. And, I borrow from Deleuze and Guattari the notion of microfascism or molecular fascism. But really, I'm just interested in the ways in which the ideas and the affects that are generating these far-right breakthroughs have been bubbling away for some time. Some of that, you can just talk about it in terms of, straightforwardly, there's been an enormous quantity of propaganda that's been drummed into people's heads for decades about migrants, about the undeserving poor, and so on. But much more fundamentally, I argue, there have been various disasters that people have been through in their lives. Some of these are personal, but many are synchronized to general social disasters like capitalist crisis, war, pandemic, most recently, of course. And then those are the acute disasters. Then there's the chronic disasters brought on by the liberal forms of governance, addiction, depression, deaths of despair. And you can see these crises sort of working in underneath the skin and getting behind people's defenses and kind of shutting them down. And for most people, the response to this has been a withdrawal into apathy, so-called. Apathy is often the wrong term, but it's a retreat to the survivalist peripheries of life. It's the politicians don't care about me, so why should I care about them? I'm going to look after me and mine, and that's it. But for a minority, and a growing minority, and a decisive minority sometimes, there's an alternative cure. Rather than the CBT or happy pills, you can take the red pill. And that involves being seduced and entranced by an idea that the problems that one has, the demons in one's head, are actually objective and real and out there in the world, but they're objective and real in a specific sense of being corporeally embodied in various persons, cultural Marxists, Muslims, migrants, and they represent various disasters: Great Replacement, white genocide. In India, it's the Romeo jihad, the idea that Muslim boys are seducing Hindu girls and waging war on the ethnic fabric of the nation and so on. And these ideas wire into a basic undercurrent of existential revenge, as William Connolly's term, a desire to take it out on somebody, to take arms against somebody. And, crucially, my argument is not that people don't have legitimate grounds and real enemies. My argument is that their concreteness, in terms of their ideology, it's a false concreteness. The social justice warrior doesn't really exist. Antifa, remember the Oregon wildfires in 2020? They said Antifa were in the woods setting fire. It's pure fantasy. But it feels concrete, and it feels concrete enough that you can do something about it, as opposed to capitalism, climate change. These are big abstract problems. You can't shoot them. You can't kill them. You can't even take them to court. What can you do to them? So this conservative response to not a revolutionary crisis, but crises with revolutionary potentials. And then just finally, in terms of what you talk about in terms of the social contagion, the manner of spreading, I started looking into this material partly because of the pandemic and interested in the ways which ideas and affects can spread similar to, like physical objects, like a virus. So, and indeed, when you're talking about something fairly simple like a trend or, a product marking or a meme, they do tend to spread in a fairly similar way. Meaning it's best to have a small world network where people are loosely connected by the internet or whatever. More complicated ideas tend to have higher thresholds for uptake. Like civil rights, for example, that's spread not through a small world network, but through networks with lots of redundancy, namely local networks where people knew each other and there was lots of overlap. The reason for that is that you don't just need one person to be telling you this is what we need to be doing. You need 3 or 4 people to confirm for you that this is valid and that we all agree with this now. And so the threshold is higher. Now, the interesting thing to me is that these ideas, which I could call disaster nationalism, we can call it something else, but that's the term I'm using. These ideas would appear to be fairly complex ideas with a high threshold of uptake, indeed quite repugnant ideas. And yet they have spread in networks and in manners, in patterns that recall the small world network. And they spread as though they're simple ideas, simple contagions. And I suggest that a number of reasons for that. One of them is straightforwardly that the thresholds have been lowered by decades of crises and by, frankly, ruling class propaganda, by the mainstreaming of far-right ideas within the liberal political spectrum, and also by, I think, the collapse of the left and its long-term consequences. I'm not just talking about, 1989 and all that, but I think this really goes back to the 70s. The collapse of the agencies of socialism and trade unionism and all those classical articulations gone. Or, I'm overstating, but certainly seriously depleted. And then following that, mental health crisis. I don't think we deal with this very well on the left. And I'm not, I have a fairly limited repertoire on this front. I can only talk about it in terms of psychoanalysis. But, it does seem to me that our mental health is suffering in ways that doesn't reduce to an individual's symptoms. And we need a kind of social psychoanalysis. And there are various approaches to that. Obviously, I'm predominantly Lacanian. But we need to take into account all of these different levels and registers to make sense of how this contagion has spread so rapidly and has such, widespread and various effects.
No, I think one of the sort of the really best things about this book is how it has a theory of uptake. Because even as listeners might know, I did a book a few months ago that had a big chapter on it about virality, but uptake was the one thing which is really difficult to try and conceptually stratify. You can get the concept of sort of the semiotics of virality and sort of linguistics of it, but in terms of uptake, it's really, there's been loads of different there's like almost a field of inoculation and uptake studies, and it's really hard to sort of square that circle. And I think one of the interesting vectors for uptake here that you do you highlight in the book as well is that the contemporary right in its ascendancy has co-opted in many ways the language of class. And I think not to say that, to make any concessions to the idea that this mythical white working class are the ones who are truly being represented by these new fascist figures. I think it's more interesting in a way is to think about the new thinking of class has emerged, particularly in the kind of J.D. Vance, Curtis Yarvin kind of right, which substitutes from a leftist theory of the ruling class to a neo-reactionary theory of the ruling class, which is, of course, this idea of the cathedral, which is... listeners, it basically means academics, journalists, anyone who's mean to you online. It's kind of the great nebulous floating signifier that structures sort of the fascist class struggle, if they will call it that. I don't think we should. Can we talk a little bit about how how class intersects with the rise of disaster nationalism? Because one of the things I think is really good that you highlight is you develop on a point that really sort of was first articulated sort of in some sort of early sociological research in the 1930s through Reich, which is that people don't vote based on their sort of objective class interests, and you do a really good job of sort of deconstructing the idea of self-interest, but particularly in the idea of people respond not to economic pain as a class, but economic pain at the personal level. And it's this kind of downfall of social mobility, which is leading to this crypto class war on the side of disaster nationalism.
We need to parse this very carefully, because when we talk about interest, and particularly the term material interest, that is an equivocal term, and it can lend itself to various perfectly legitimate acceptations. Most of the time, if you're listening to a bourgeois psephologist or even a social democrat, your material interest means, do you have enough money in your pocket? Do you have access to various needs like healthcare, comfortable housing, all that kind of stuff? All very important, we need that stuff. But the classical Marxist conception of interest has something else at stake, which is the emancipation of the working class. And whether you take an historicist approach or not, or whether you go with Poulantzas and others there, basically you've got some idea that there is a horizon of interest, which doesn't just correspond to how much money you've got in your pocket. And it's very important, this, because historically, workers have often fought really crucial battles, not for money, but to defend their organization, to defend their unions. And they've often been put out, quite considerably by that. And bourgeois economists wouldn't understand it. So that's a crucial part of this. What is an interest? And then I suggest that really when we're talking about an interest is an intentional orientation to the world. And so although we might not have much faith in the sort of messianic conception of the proletariat, in the 1920s sense, in as much as that just doesn't exist today, nonetheless, we can talk about the ways in which an interest can be formed, which doesn't really correspond to immediate, what's in your wallet kind of thinking. So, people who go out marching for Gaza, they're not going to get more money in their pocket. They're not going to get more leisure time. They're going to get less, that kind of thing. Or, some people will take even greater sacrifices. And if we set up this opposition between interest and something else like altruism, we completely miss the point, and it's very misleading. Interest often can be altruistic because your horizon of intentionality can stretch into someone else's, and indeed generally does stretch into someone else's domain. So in terms of how people respond to crises, disasters, and what have you, there's a couple of things. First of all, in terms of the 1930s literature from Marxists, there was some pretty good stuff. I can't remember names. I'm very bad at remembering names, but there was some good sociology written by German Marxists, which basically, I think it might have been Richard Lowenthal or somebody, made a distinction in the German working class between those who were unemployed and those who were employed and remained in unions. And the crucial point they made was, first of all, the recession came along, the capitalist crisis smashed left organization in the workplace. It smashed traditional forms of, communist recruitment, social democratic recruitment, etc. It made things a lot harder. And just in terms of class mobilization, made things a lot harder. Second of all, it stratified. It created two layers, at least two layers. Those who basically, because they're unemployed, they tend to gravitate much more towards a kind of ultra-left, which was the Communist Party at the time, the third period strategy. Whereas the employed working class were terrified of losing what little they had and gravitated towards social democracy, which basically meant toleration of pruning, austerity, that kind of thing. And so you can see how historical circumstances form discrete particular interests. But then there's something else, and you mentioned Reich. There's, on the one hand, you can say, well, people respond to crises through the concrete myriad of circumstances that they find themselves in and through their own concrete libidinal economy. Okay, so there's no political economy without libidinal economy, and you don't access political economy, as it were, except through the interval of your libidinal economy. So Reich then develops a theory of libidinal economy. He says, the fascists have criticized us for leaving the soul consciousness out of our equations. And they're right, but they mystify consciousness. They mystify the soul. So I'm going to talk about it in Freudian terms, in terms of basic patterns of sexuality, psychosexual development, etc. We could argue about how successful he was. I think he got at least some of the way there. I think is very important. Certainly, I think he pinned down something that's really crucial, which is the thwarted rebelliousness, the reactionary commixture of a kind of slavishness and a rebelliousness, and the need to find a way to modulate those two polarities. Now, his focus was on the authoritarian family as the sort of locus of this stuff. I don't think that works today. If it worked then, it definitely doesn't work now. We've been seeing the decline of what they would call the paternal function, the decline of the other for some time. Prohibition just doesn't have the same force it once did. And if you look at today's far right, it's often brazenly, gleefully transgressive. It's much more anomic, sociopathic. Think of someone like Andrew Tate, wanting the freedom to rape. Look at the MRA fora and the Incel fora, celebrating stuff like pedophilia. Look at, Donald Trump bragging about pussy grabbing, all of this sort of stuff. This is not sexually repressed in the classical sense. There's something else going on there. I think part of what they want, actually, is to reinstate sexual repression and to reinstate desire as the desire to know where one's place is. I think that's a big part of what's going on.
Oh, absolutely. Craig, please go for it.
Yeah, Richard, thanks. I really think you flag up an important issue here, which is the inadequacy of these older paradigms of psychoanalysis and repression and so forth to articulate what's really happening here. And I think one of the things that your book does nicely, particularly in the chapter that I focused on, which is the role of the internet in sort of developing and manifesting the kinds of personae and psychologies that we now associate with the far right. And we've already mentioned Andrew Tate and so forth. But I was hoping that we could trace a line from, I guess, what we would call the architecture or network of the far right today, from capital investment all the way to what we would call the psychology of either the lone wolf killer or the member of the troll army, and those who depend on this very sort of odd schedule of reinforcement via recognition from people like Donald Trump or Modi or Duterte or any number of these far-right leaders. And the particular chapter that I looked at, you talked about the development of these proxy armies that have this ambiguous self-appointed memberships. And there's a milieu of violent discourse that folds back into the alienation that they feel. And then there's this kind of reflexive relationship that happens between people like Trump or Modi, where maybe you'll get picked out on social media and your tweet will be retweeted by them. And there'll be this sort of validating movement. And then these people then become a kind of avatar that then influence others to do the same. And you have an interesting line in this chapter where you said that in the salad days of the internet, Felix Guattari looked forward to the post-media age, where he says the element of suggestion, even hypnotism, present in the current media would vanish. Well, clearly that has not been the case. It's been amplified and utilized in this process of radicalization. And I was hoping you could just illuminate, for example, how things like online troll armies that come into flood comment sections of either a Yahoo article or a YouTube video to put the very familiar comments that we see today, actually feminism is fascism, actually leftism is fascism, and that there are basically plantations of sorts where these comments are cultivated and propagated, and these companies are hired by capital interests. And the people who get tied into these far right movements, they think they are being transgressive, that they are the war machine of our time fighting against the state, when in fact many of the people who fund the groups that encourage the sort of grassroots movements are already tied into these corporate and political entities who are paying these troll armies. So in fact, these quote unquote transgressive acts fold right back onto the state apparatus. And so with all that said, I was hoping that you could recapitulate what you wrote in the chapter on troll armies and tell us, how is it that someone goes from being an online commenter, an incel at age 15, and what their connection is to, for example, an investor who's trying to fund a far-right candidate somewhere in Europe?
So, of course, Freud's term for suggestion was transference. And that's kind of what we've got there, a sort of erotic bond taking place, usually one way. That's sort of classic parasocial model, taking place between leader and follower. In terms of the mechanisms of this, I think we have to be very careful not to make this into an instrumentalist account where capital is running the show, because by and large, capital is a laggard in terms of these movements. Capital comes afterwards and moves to the right, and that's what we're seeing with Silicon Valley capital. By and large, the American ruling class is not for Trump. It's not for the far right. Most of them are, I mean, the money overwhelmingly went to Biden and Harris and Hillary Clinton. That's where they are. They want reliable, traditional Washington governance. They don't trust this new type of upstart movement. And yet, of course, these movements wouldn't get anywhere if there weren't substantial outliers or sections of the ruling class willing to support them. In the UK, we had a movement called the English Defence League, a violent street movement, which was quite possibly had some involvement from intelligence, we don't know, but definitely had funders like Alan Lake, who was a city millionaire, had plenty of money, and he threw it at them, and he was, pardon me, an obsessive Islamophobe. So you get these sectors of capital which are not directly plugged into the circuits of globalization. We're talking here only about Euro-America here. You get these business interests that have a rather different sense of how capitalism should work. They're not up for multilateralism. They're not up for the European Union. They're not up for the institutions which they regard, through their efforts to achieve a stable structure of reproduction of capital, they regard as limiting and inhibiting their aggressive initiative and so on. And those are the sectors of capital that have tended to, they're sectors of the city, for example, venture capitalist firms, that kind of thing, who've rallied behind Farage and reform, even though they don't speak for the city as a whole. The city as a whole is fairly status quo, establishment oriented, wanted to stay in the European Union. But nonetheless, you've got these sectors that basically find themselves confined. Then, of course, you've got people like Rupert Murdoch. In India, this is actually worth sort of pausing on for a little bit. In places like India or Hungary, or to some extent Israel, you've got an interesting media environment where a small cluster of billionaires and moguls and oligarchs have been able to buy up the most important media and have outsized weight within the polity. They project considerable political influence. In the US, until fairly recently, and this is one of the reasons why the US media sort of aligned to the resistance, you have much more of a class-wide purview. You have boards of, you have ownership that is various corporations. It's not just one guy. It's various corporations running, say, owning the Washington Post or owning this or that. And apart from that, you've got, advertising revenue systems that mean that there tends to be much more of a confluence of capitalist interests sort of pouring into them. I think when you've got the development of capitalism to the stage where there is a small number of people who have historically unprecedented amounts of wealth, whether globally or just in their country. And that amount of wealth allows them to stand aloof from where the capitalist class is as a whole. Someone like Musk, now Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and they, don't really have to take into account the long-term class-wide perspective that the corporate ruling class generally does. Then you can start to see that they would be much more open to a kind of far-right adventurism. So I think there's an element of that going on. So I guess the point is, how do we find given that this incipient fascism, this new far right, manages to fuse heteroclite social elements across classes, how do they manage to do that? And I guess the point there is, one doesn't have to be a member of a party anymore. That's the great thing. So, you could use the idea of assemblages to talk about the ways in which different social elements are put together for a machinery that works for a period of time. And then that's put aside, and then the machinery is kind of built. That's kind of what's been happening and social industry networks have been crucial to coordinating these things. The other thing about it is that there's a way of talking about internet activity as though it's a form of agency, which might actually be misleading, because there's a way in which, when we're bombarded by, let's say, data, information, claims, affects, etc., on the internet, it comes in a format that prevents and directly precludes any kind of critical reflection on it. And to that extent, you never get a chance to really consent to the idea. It's not a question of whether you consent. You become a relay for the idea and the affect, and that feels like agency. That feels like you've taken ownership of it. And so this is what Nick Dyer Witherford calls a levée en masse. Essentially, we are being recruited without ever having consented, without even realizing that we've been recruited. And I think a really good example, and I finish on this point, is Duterte's sort of use of rhythmic organization. Sorry, there's a bit of police and ambulance going on in the background.
It adds to the ambiance. It happens every episode.
Well, okay. So, Duterte's strategy, he had some fairly clever social industry strategists who got together troll farms. And it wasn't a case of they would go out and begin by harassing journalists and what have you. What they did was they began by setting up local-based social media accounts, Facebook and what have you. And they would talk about local issues, and they would build a community. And then as the election approached, the idea was to build up a rhythm of talking about crime issues. And, they put some violent crime story and make it the centerpiece for a day. And as the election approached, they would have 2 or 3 or 4 a day. And gradually they would build up a mood that, we're being overwhelmed by violent crime. That was Duterte's big talking point, and Duterte became a focus and a source of interest. And so you've got a small number of people who are consciously knowing what they're doing, who are being paid to do it. They're not in charge of anything. They don't direct it. They act on orders, but they're being paid to do it. But beyond that, you've got much wider layers of people who are involved in these fora, who have no idea they're being used. And then beyond that, you've got ripples of people who are being affected by a social contagion that they have no idea where it came from. They don't know where it started. So you can see, on the one hand, you've got the flows of affects, existential revenge, all that's coming from the bottom up. And on the other hand, you've got the ways in which that is weaponized, turned into cyber war, coming from a far-right leadership in order to give political shape and structure to these affects that are emerging. So, I don't know if that answers your question. That's possibly the best way I could describe it.
Maybe just one quick follow-up to that is, while reading that particular chapter, it made me think that the evolution of the mimetic structure, the mimetic apparatus of the internet, just leans right, ultimately, because of the kinds of libidinal investments. And it almost seems like the implicit practical action that we need to take is to extricate ourselves from these circuits. Maybe you could just say one or two things about that.
Yeah, I think it's a serious possibility. There are problems with that, but I mean, let's just start with, does it lean right? I think it leans stupid, and that leans right. I think that the ways in which these systems work are designed to basically they appropriate, they colonize and commodify the space of our social lives. So it's no longer the case that used to be said, oh, the internet's not the real world. Yeah, it is. If you spend most of your social life communicating with other people through these machines, that is your social life. So your social life now consists of generating digitally produced images, literally a simulacrum, in systems where the protocols are designed not just according to the sort of profit interest, but also according to the visions and ideologies of rich guys from North Carolina who value status, hierarchy, celebrity, and competition. That's the system you're being put to work for. So your social life is, it's much worse than Theodore Adorno's culture industry. Like you could say he exaggerated and what have you. This is actually much worse. It's much more top down. It's much more, the sense in which we are literally our social lives literally being written for us. So there's a sense in which it takes us into a social life that's much more of a playground for a kind of a gnomic, almost, I wouldn't say neoliberal, because I think that language now is a bit overused, and we may be in a post-neoliberal phase, but certainly an aggressively capitalist mode of existence, intensely nihilistic as regards information, knowledge, values, etc., and intensely asocial in terms of one's relations to others on the platforms. The incentive is that you should be able to turn on any other user on the turn of a dime, no matter how close you were yesterday. If they sort of, let's say, appear to transgress the mores or fall out of favor with your particular tribe, in order to keep cred, in order to keep your, as they say, social capital, whatever, you have to be able to turn on them. So this creates or incentivizes fairly weak relationships and relationships that can easily be exploited and monetized. In terms of what we do about that, see, I have equivocated on this because I'm torn between, on the one hand, we can't cede these networks to those with power and the ruling class, because frankly, I remember what it was like before the social industry networks, when, like, if you went and had a protest, you had to look out on the BBC and the Guardian and whatever, and maybe there'd be a picture of a stray placard, and they would say several hundred people marched in London that day, and I was there, and it was 10,000 or whatever. Like that, you would be lied about, you wouldn't be properly represented, and therefore there'd be no way of communicating with other people that something significant happened and that there is a movement out there and you can be part of it. That's no longer the case, and hasn't been the case for some time. So I would be wary of giving up that kind of tool. And also, I think that it would be possible to use it if you're doing it politically, in a professional way. One of the problems has been that people have tended to use it as the social industry intended to be used. Namely, we go and spill our guts. We sort of confess all our secrets. We talk about our breakups, mental health breakdowns, and we plead for sympathy and support. And it's never enough, because that drip feeding of digitally, algorithmically measured and titrated love just doesn't feel real enough. It doesn't fill the gap. But so, there would be a way of relating to it strategically, if and only if you have some form of organization and friendship circle outside the network. So that basically that's your primary reference. The social industry is secondary. So you're not spending all your time building your networks on the social industry. You're building networks elsewhere. That would be, I think, probably the most sensible mediating strategy. And yet I can also see that there's a fairly strong argument increasingly that we're doing ourselves more harm than good, But ultimately that is a strategic question. I think either way, the crucial thing is to break the addiction, because these systems are predicated on a model of addiction. Now, their understanding of addiction is hopelessly wrong, but the techniques happen to work, so it doesn't matter. if we get addicted to their systems, then, we are essentially weakening ourselves politically, regardless of what else we do. But if we do not respond, for example, you see something on Twitter or whatever, and it's somebody saying something obviously stupid and wrong and destructive, and you feel an urge to type the catharsis, to rage at them and type even a whole thread of block capitals. If you respond to that, then you're capitulating to an addiction. All right. So there's an argument there that you could say we just need to relate to these platforms differently. However, and this is one of those points where it's the logic of the social contagion plays a role. If enough people start to withdraw from the platforms, then the network effect and therefore the usefulness of these platforms would diminish and more people would withdraw. And the question is, what lies on the other side of that? What are we building instead? Because I think actually, if we are able to build, organizations, social life, this goes well beyond just having a political party now. It's social life as such has to be rebuilt. If we are building something like that, if we're able to forge networks in our communities or whatever, then I think that will lessen the compulsive, addictive power of these networks and thus reduce the power that, people like Musk have over us.
Hey everyone, this is Craig, and this is the spot in the podcast where ads would normally go, but Acid Horizon does not want to use outside advertisers to support our endeavor. So why don't you subscribe to our Patreon account? In fact, beginning this month on February 16th, 2025, we will start our newest reading group, which is Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, led by our own Adam C. Jones. If you want more of Deleuze and Guattari, hop into our already ongoing The Anti-Oedipus Files reading group. We are just getting started. Our goal as a podcast has been to bring thoughtful discussion and philosophy to as many ears as possible and do so in a way that allows us to keep it going. And one way that you can help us ensure that we continue our mission is by subscribing to our Patreon and joining our reading groups for only $5 a month. Adam is a recent PhD graduate. I have multiple graduate degrees in philosophy and education, and Will is on his way to earning his PhD as well. So please come study with us. In fact, if you want to have a more intensive study experience, check out the new Luminary Patreon tier on our Patreon account. Or you can take one of the multiple classes with Acid Horizon at the new Center for Social Research coming this summer. Currently, you can register for the class Creativity and Intoxication led by our own Adam C. Jones. So navigate to the show notes, subscribe to our Patreon, and check out Adam's class at the new center. All right, let's get back to the discussion.
No, it's incredibly important to highlight this tension. And yeah, in terms of the social media sort of industry, it does feel like it, as you highlight, sort of a hyper-proletarianization of everyday life through the medium of writing. The internet is dead. I think Tiziana Terranova is pretty good at saying that it's dead. It's just platforms now. And I think both in your work and in some of my recent sort of writing, we've tried to sort of work out this idea of what does it mean now that everything we do is producing data for someone else, and that is feeding back into our various kinds of behaviors. In what sort of feedback loop is this creating? And in terms of the infrastructure, yeah, absolutely. It has to be an addictive infrastructure because they've kind of reversed the paradigm between power engineering and communicative engineering. We are kind of the things that push the posts through the feeds by creating them in order to lubricate the time between ads. And I think it's also it is a weird dilemma because if we're still using it if we're using it in the personal sense, like Twitter as a big group chat, then in a sense it makes sense to go to Blue Sky or something because you don't want to be in a party full of Nazis. But if you're using it as akin to like, I don't know, a hyper-mediated, accelerated form of like, I don't know, the post office or something, then it makes somewhat more sense. Because if you think about, as you're talking about with activist networks, things like anti-raids groups, these are things that are products of social media. And as you said, we've never had sort of the ability to debunk, say, a Rafi Berg edited BBC news article completely absolving Israel of the sort of genocidal atrocities in Palestine in 140 characters, and that can then be sort of virally spread. But it's interesting because of how well the contemporary right have used virality sort of in their own favor. I mean, I'm thinking about the networks of people funded by Thiel. I mean, people funded by Orban, the MCC, Compacts. Not to get on my usual horse, listeners, and talk about Spiked Online for a bit, but you know what I mean when I talk about those guys and how they get in everywhere, especially the Compact a lot as well, even sort of going so far as to, I'd say, infect some parts of, and some, well, predominantly the most online parts, I'd say, of the left. But no, sorry, I've rambled there a bit too long. I know, Will, sorry, you probably have something.
Yeah, there's this interesting point that you're making about the promise of a new repression that also promises a kind of infinite, what you call sort of sexual enjoyment or limitless sexual enjoyment. And you talk about a particular new form of celebrity culture, the sort of hyper-masculinity that comes from figures like Andrew Tate, where sort of the way in which, say, for example, Hitler is treated in texts like Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, Andrew Tate is a form of sexual investment by, and I know this is strange that I'm asking a psychoanalytic question given the nature of my own stuff here, but I'm wondering if you could extrapolate a little bit on the way you talk about the rise of a sort of semiotic sexual violence that's sort of permeating through American youth right now. I mean, American youth are more conservative than the preceding generation, which has surprised a lot of people in their 20s, that their teenage brothers are far more, I guess, traditionalist, they call themselves. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the relationship between these new modes of communication that dominate or at least take up our leisure time, and the possibility for, these singular figures like Andrew Tate, that even though we have this disparate networked system, in the last 10 years, it's really produced these somewhat singular, even if they're a little niche, figureheads through which kind of new form of misogyny flows.
So, I mean, first of all, just in terms of the reactionary figureheads, I mean, I think you can go back and look at some of the earliest ones. I don't know if the earliest was Peterson or somebody else, but you can follow, there's a trend. They tend to become a lot more stupid, and one is almost tempted to revive Lukács's problematic book, The Destruction of Reason, in terms of the idea that, they almost give up on the idea of actually engaging with serious critique of the enemy's ideas. In this case, they give up on reality as such. They're much more interested in infotainment. They're much more interested in the logic of movies and kitsch and so on. Just in terms of someone like Tate and the promise of limitless sexual enjoyment, in other words, enjoyment without boundaries set by, the Matrix or whatever, which prevents me from being able to rape and enslave whoever I want. Just following the logic of that all the way through, that's would pretty clearly, if generalized, be an unbearable, unlivable society of rapists and victims. It would not be a society as such. And therefore, there has to be a limit somewhere. There has to be a new repression. And so what fascism has traditionally offered is a selective liberalization. What the Nazis and, the recent sort of historical work on this indicates that this is the case. What the Nazis did was, essentially, we encourage our teenage boys and girls to have sex. We encourage our soldiers to carouse. We encourage nudism and healthy Aryan sexuality, not this Jewish sexuality. That was crucial to them. Not this garish kind of desire that they believed was particularly Jewish and they associated with Weimar and so on. And also, crucially, we are going to sterilize, homosexuals. We're going to sterilize anybody who doesn't fit with our biological paradigm. And we are going to prevent Aryans and Jews from marrying, and so on. So on the one hand, you've got a liberalization in as much as there's a permissiveness. You can do anything you like almost. And in fact, there's a certain group of people, if you do something to them, nobody's going to say anything to you. You know, if you harm a Jew, like, you might get arrested, but, you know, only if you threaten the social order, really. So there's permission on the one side and repression on the other. And this, I think, is the dialectic that we're seeing play out today. You know, on the one hand, pussy grabbers, and on the other hand, we do not recognize any more than two sexes, two genders. We have no.
Well, technically, we recognize one sex according to that executive order because it's upon conception. So the future and present right now is female in the United States. Craig and I are both, according to the President of the United States and the United States federal government, females.
Well, I mean, there's an argument, I think Andrea Longchu once wrote, we're all aspiring females. But I think the rule with some, you know, the things that Donald Trump says from the right is, you know what he meant, and that's just it, you know, so he can say what he wants. So, yeah, in terms of this, I'm not sure what the through line of your question was. I mean, I got the bit about Andrew Tate, and then there was something that came afterwards. But, you know, this is what I meant by the sort of connection between, you know, the fantasy of limitless enjoyment, which is a fantasy, it's impossible, obviously, and the instantiation of new repressions.
The through line is this, that even though we have these sort of hyper-networked, decentralized modes of communication in the last, and you know, Web 2 really promised this extraordinarily expansive, almost federated dispersal of platforms, it's all kind of solidified into a big three. And I'm wondering if that's part and parcel to your argument about the production of these sort of new, what could we call them, like totalitarian entertainers, like Andrew Tate.
Yeah, the trend towards monopolization, well, first of all, commodifying, because, you know, we know that Twitter, before it was Twitter, the basic idea for it had already been developed as an activist app. And then it was one of the people who designed it went to work for Odeo around 2006. They had an internal presentation. They liked it. The investors thought it was an interesting idea. And then they went away and they had a think, and they came up with this brand new idea for an app, which would be kind of like texting, but in public. And it was exactly, well, not exactly, but very similar to one that had just been used and designed for activists. So there's a process of commodifying the internet accelerated by the platforms. And then, of course, there's monopolization, which I think is intrinsic to the dynamic for all sorts of reasons. Network effects, obviously, being number one. But I think the crucial stage here is that they reach the limits of their growth and they start, you know, becoming desperate for something else. So you saw around 2019, they were starting to look at ideas like, should we invest in crypto? There seems to be a lot of money in crypto. How are we going to make money? We need money. And the money wasn't going to come from expanding the user base. Facebook already had like 3 billion users. What more were they going to get? So they plateaued. Instagram was plateauing. Twitter was plateauing. This was before TikTok came along. All right. So they experiment with cryptocurrencies and finance and things like that. It doesn't work. They've reached an objective limitation on what they can do with their platforms, and then suddenly China is out competing them. And, you know, that's not going to be the last time we're going to hear about that. And they become wildly, rapidly reactionary, the sort of tech bosses and what have you. So it's in that context that I think you see the resonance machine between far-right social industry disinfotainers and the social industry sort of accumulation mechanisms. And, you know, they're both making money off each other. And that raises a couple of questions. One, what's so enthralling about this stuff? You know, because the algorithms, we know the algorithms tend to promote it. Why? Because they think that people will get addicted to it and they'll watch a lot more YouTube and so on if they are exposed to this far-right propaganda. What's so thrilling about far-right propaganda? It does, for some reason, tend to be addictive. I think of it as being akin to extreme sports. People are drawn to extreme material, something that is naughty and dangerous and transgressive, and it's just put in front of them. They don't have to go and search for it. It's just there. They can have a little watch. It's not going to do anything. And they're not doing anything. It just came up. So they watch it, and then you get somebody like this guy in England, a lone wolf murderer. I forget his name. But he plowed his car into a bunch of people outside Finsbury Park Mosque. He started off a few weeks before. He wasn't political particularly. He was mentally unwell, very depressed, unemployed, drunk, not well liked by his neighbors, and had problems. But he watched a Panorama documentary about grooming gangs in England. And if you know about the publicity here, it tends to conflate grooming gangs with grooming gangs composed of Pakistani men. And so, it's very racialized. From there, he went on and watched a bunch of Tommy Robinson documentaries, so-called documentaries on YouTube. And these documentaries are very widely watched, and they make a lot of money. And within a few weeks, he was saying he was a soldier against Islam. A soldier. This guy was mentally ill, unemployed, alcoholic, but he became a soldier. He'd acquired a sudden, as he saw it, a kind of importance and dignity, an historical role. And when he went and slammed his car into them and the police came and got him, he only killed one man. But he said, I want to kill them all. I want to kill every fucking Muslim. He was psychically fueled for genocide. And the police arrested him and said, you can kill me now, I've done my job. And this happens to be a common thing with these lone wolf killers, almost every one of them to a man. And they almost all are men, with a single exception that I can think of. They almost always envision or seek their death after committing their act. And so there's a kind of suicidal element to it. But anyway, you see how this resonance machine works, because the mass killings, the lone wolf killings, are promotional material. Anders Behring Breivik was explicit about this in his manifesto. The killing is the marketing strategy for the manifesto. It'll make people read the manifesto. And his followers followed that logic because they never wrote anything new. I mean, what he had done was cut and paste a bunch of stuff from American libertarian think tanks and traditional right-wing sort of discourse and what have you, and throw in some sci-fi fantasies of his own, future nuclear war, all that kind of stuff. The others who followed him tended to repeat one another's arguments and statements and just segue in some of their own personal complaints about life and about the way the world had treated them, and concoct a kind of synthetic conspiracy theory that bound political and personal grievances. Well, you can see how that creates ripples of interest and new recruits. And so the system was thriving on that. And then there's just one other thing, because your focus was specifically on the misogynist aspect of it. I think it's just perfectly obvious that this is, we call it hyper-masculinity. We can call it compensatory masculinity, because what do we get on their television, on their YouTube channels and on their podcasts and what have you? Every other minute, there is a new supplement. Every other minute, like, masculinity apparently needs a prop. There's vitamins that you can take that will, neutralize illnesses, that will make you super strong. Russell Brand's doing it now. The other day I saw he did a video in which he took some supplement, herbal supplement, and he could lift up these suitcases and he was very strong. This is a guy who would have been doing that as a comedy skit 10 years ago. And now he's doing it for real and making money off it. So there's the idea that people feel a certain dissatisfaction with their masculinity. Something doesn't fit. There's a failure of, the signifiers of masculinity to coincide, to add up. And, for years I've read some of these backlash books, and they can go back to the 2000s. And it was at first kind of ironic, but it was like the idea of masculinity fundamentally is about rage and aggression. And you can see why that would be, because that's far more empowering, or seems to be far more animating anyway, than the more common situation, which is a feeling of utter paralysis, a complete lack of agency. So when you go on Twitter and say, after Trump won the election, say, oh, your body, my choice forever. Okay. This is, a claim of mastery, which of course will never be fulfilled, but it's the fantasy of having some sort of real efficacious agency in the world. And instead of that being a political problem with how capitalism has essentially proletarianized us in terms of our life skills and our ability to navigate the world, it's turned into a problem of we've given away too much to these bitches. They've taken everything from us, the feminists. And I think for the kinds of people who are attracted to this, and this is the final point I'll make on that, it's often pitched in terms of, I am entitled to sex, I deserve sex, why do women deny me sex? And yet when you follow the logic of it through, first of all, it's bound to this fusion of free market economics and evolutionary psychology, which is fairly deterministic. And so it ultimately comes up with the idea that, well, actually, nobody can help anything they do because women are genetically determined to prefer men with this shape of chin and this amount of muscle mass and this height, et cetera, et cetera. What was it Peterson said? Women mate up and across dominance hierarchies, this kind of thing. Well, okay, so then that means that nobody can do anything about anything. So what are you complaining about? So either you can go black pill and basically end up suicidal, or, you can sort of push it to its, sort of follow it through to its limits. They claim to want to have sex. They do everything possible to make sure that doesn't happen, to make sure it's extremely unlikely to happen. I'm not just being snarky about it. I mean, to some extent, you can't help it. But also, fundamentally, I empathize with the loneliness of young men. I get it. And part of the problem here is I don't think they really want women to have sex with them. I don't think they are really interested in sex at all. I think they're incredibly lonely and starved of love and, attention and what have you. And that's just the kind of society that we live in today. I think they are utterly clueless, at a loss how to engage in the world. That's what I was like when I was 21, 22, maybe 30, 35, 38, but basically that can drag on a bit. But the point is, cluelessness in the world is not an original experience. And it's not particular to men, but it can be experienced if you're used to the idea that men should be decisive, in charge, efficacious. That no longer exists. So this is something that Susan Faludi was writing about back in the 1990s. So it's not a new problem. It's just been radicalized to a particular extent. But fundamentally, I think that the way in which they talk about women, their fantasies about women, they're not misogynistic in the way that a lot of erotic fantasies are. They're counter-erotic. The way they describe women is loaded not just with, not with this curious attraction that one has to the disgusting slut and what have you. It's actually loaded with fear and contempt. And so I don't really buy their argument that they are incels. I think they are volcels in denial. And I think that to the extent that they are incels, they're not unique because everybody's an incel some of the time. Nobody gets the sex they want, all of the time, or even most of the time. Everybody makes do with some sort of approximation of what they would like to have. So yeah, and that I think is the sort of background condition for these guys that seem incredibly self-confident and appear to be, take his appeal to young teenagers and guys is he's got money, he's good at fighting, and he boasts about his sexual conquests. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager, a lot of the boys around me would have lapped that up. So you can see where that's going.
Yeah, Tate seems to offer a kind of perverse sort of reformulation, almost like kind of sexual social democracy on the one hand, the kind of, the idea of redistributed girlfriends at one point, and then straight up the standard masculinist, fascist fantasy of you will never achieve social mobility, so you should be in debt to one person and one person only, and that's me with my school, and I'll teach you how to be one of the few exploiters that could exploit the rig system by continuing to rig it. And I think one of the interesting ways in which you tie together all of these psychosexual fragments into a sort of political examples of where this ultimately, I think, might end up going is in the fantasy of redemptive violence is enacted as actual violence, in which you may still suffer, but the suffering of the other makes your suffering worth it, because eventually you get to make them feel like Trump. People will suffer because of Trump's tariffs, for example, but it's fine because the nebulous woke, by which they mean trans people, black people, working class people who don't follow the line, are going to be hit even more. And one of the things I really appreciate about this book is its analysis of the cases where we talk about it as if it's coming in the West, particularly in light of in the UK the examples of the pogroms in across England last year. But in a way, these have already happened in other places, and they're sort of going to recur happening. And the examples you give is particularly the mass slaughter, the death squads under Duterte in the Philippines, particularly the Gujarat pogrom in 2002. And I think it's so I was going to ask, in what ways are events like the Gujarat pogrom and sort of the ascent of Modi, are they kind of emblematic of the entire process of disaster nationalism? What might focusing on that example erode from a very sort of Western-centric analysis of the rise of fascist or fascisizing forces? And overall, is this redemptive violence going to be a signature move of this as it reaches a new site of ascendancy? I mean, arguably we could say this with the case of the Israeli genocide in Palestine, but then that might treat them as a bit too pre-fascist, where I don't think the term fascist is necessarily inaccurate in the case of what the Israeli state is currently in the process of doing and what its configuration is.
Interesting. I mean, in terms of the Israeli state, I would say that it hasn't yet capitulated to fascism in as much as it remains an exclusionary democracy founded on colonial dispossession. But the genocide certainly has catalyzed and potentiated a lot of fascist energies that were already circulating. And, I think Netanyahu may survive in one form or other, but the Israeli far right, are going to take a terrible revenge for this ceasefire. I mean, they're not happy. But just to get back to your point, Gujarat, I think, was the canary in the coal mine, because what you saw there was, first of all, in the northern Indian state of Gujarat, I think this is 2002, the BJP looked like they were going to lose the next election. The BJP is the hard right nationalist party, and looked like they were going to lose the next election. The reason they looked like they were going to lose the next election is because they had badly mishandled an earthquake that took place the previous year, and they were condemned for it, widely condemned. A lot of people suffered. A lot of relief wasn't delivered because they weren't interested in those kinds of things. However, shortly before the election, in a few months before the election, they basically contrived a disaster. So there had been a fire on a train. A number of Hindu pilgrims had died. These guys had been racially abusing Muslims on this train. And the BJP leadership asserted that the fire was caused by thousands of local Muslim thugs who'd come out with firebombs, and thrown them at the train. And they said this is a genocide. The Muslims, the Alis, Malis, and Jamalis, as Modi called them, these guys are waging genocide against our people. And that precipitated a round of official and semi-official and unofficial incitement right down to the grassroots level. Now, the BJP is used to inciting pogroms. Pogroms is part of a regular electoral cycle in India, but this was going to be serious. And so basically you got thousands of people descending on Muslim areas with weapons, swords, guns, acid, everything. And they included lots of people who would ordinarily be excluded from Indian nationalism, like the Dalits. They were involved. Women were involved too. Right-wing Hindu women were involved. And they were involved in murdering infants, raping women, shoving iron rods up them, chopping men to pieces with swords, setting people on fire while they were still alive, unthinkable things. And the result of this was that the BJP became a lot more popular in the state. They became very, very popular, especially with their previously demoralized electorate. And rather than losing the next election, they increased their share of the vote by 5%. And that share of the vote went up most in the areas where there'd been most violence. So this was not something that was purely top-down or purely bottom-up. This was something that was synchronized at different levels, and it involved the coordination of spontaneous, as it were, popular violence with coordinated state violence. And crucially, it showed that electoral sort of collective violence is not an electoral disadvantage for the far right. To the contrary, it is a unique selling point, particularly when it comes in the form of an assertion of omnipotence against a neighbor, a despised neighbor. And when it comes to the political economy of the far right, there's a number of things that they don't have that interwar fascism had. They don't really have a class ameliorationist agenda. They're not addressing that at all. They're not claiming to be anti-capitalist. They're not trying to transcend class, as Michael Mann describes in terms of interwar fascist ideology, by reforming the system or spiritualize it or give it another meaning. And they're not trying to achieve some form of utopian horizon because they don't have one. This is, like the utopian horizon of fascism was a radical remaking of the human species through colonization and through the application of biology as a principle of government. Nothing like that exists today. So what they do have is a very raw, muscular capitalism. It's capitalism with the gloves off, no politically correct constraints, no woke constraints, no environmentalist constraints, and particularly no constraints, none of these liberal constitutional constraints on majoritarian ethnic violence. That's the critical point, because our political economy is you will get to revenge your wrongs on a hated neighbor. You will get to have a moment of your wildest omnipotence fantasies come true. You can do anything in that moment. Leon Trotsky was very sharp about this because, of course, he had seen problems and he understood what that meant. He said, in that moment, the trembling slave of hunger and the police is capable of anything. He's a little king, a tsar. He can throw a grandmother out the window. He can rape a baby. He can do anything he wants. There is a sense in which it answers the felt prevalence of paralysis, of lack of agency. It gives you something to do. It energizes you. And we've seen that repeatedly. For example, in 2022, when Bolsonaro lost the election, he was supposed to lose 20 points or something like that. That's how far he was behind. By the time of the election, he lost it by a fraction of a percent. Because over that summer, he and his lower-ranking supporters and his grassroots voters and what have you had engaged in the most frantic process of demonization and incitement and murder. Bolsonaro was going around saying we should machine gun leftists. They shouldn't be allowed in the country. They shouldn't be allowed to exist. And his supporters were putting that into practice as a program. They were going around picking Workers' Party supporters and threatening them or fights with them or murdering them. And it was a very bloody summer, but it was energizing. It was exciting. It gave them something to get excited about. Same thing with Donald Trump in 2020. Had it not been for the movement against Black Lives Matter and the violent vigilante movement and the deification of Kyle Rittenhouse and the appearance at the Republican Congress of these white families, suburbanites defending themselves with guns, and the spiraling off of the Republican leadership into cloud cuckoo land, then the so-called insurrection and Stop the Steal, all of that stuff would not have been possible. I think that contributed to the fact that Trump, although he lost the election, he actually increased his absolute number of votes quite significantly, and his vote share incrementally went up. So, there is a pattern wherein what we would assume to be embarrassing or something that they would have to dissociate themselves from is actually politically empowering for the far right. And then finally, just on Duterte got elected saying these crazy, outrageous things that a lot of people probably thought he was joking about, or they were just impressed that he would just say whatever he wants. Said, Hitler killed so many million Jews. There are 3 million drug addicts in the Philippines. I'm happy to kill them all. Talking about, shooting women between the legs, all sorts of things. But he did openly say, I'm going to do what I did when I ran. I'm going to forget the name of the city that he ran in the south of the Philippines. He ran that city like a gangster. And he used words. Often people, by the way, were individuals from the communist movement. The Filipino communist movement made a huge historic error getting into bed with this guy. And don't forget, they actually joined his government in 2016. And then, of course, straight into a bear trap, and he went after them. Anyway, he said, that's what I'm going to do. You can forget the human rights laws. You can forget all this stuff. And that's why he won. He didn't win with a supermajority. He won 39%. He then proceeded to carry out his promises. Tens of thousands of people killed, journalists killed, assassinated, the dissidents flung in jail, all of this stuff happening. And all at that time, the share of, first of all, his level of popularity rarely dipped far below 10%, his approval ratings. Secondly, the number of people supporting his policy is usually over 70%, approaching 80%. And critically, this was the case even though the majority of people in the Philippines, when asked in the polls, said, yes, I fear that I or someone I know, someone close to me, could be killed by one of these death squads. So what was the promise of the death squad? What was it offering them? Because actually a lot of the people who appreciated it were the poor, and that's who it was aimed against. Well, like you can sort of talk in quotidian terms of, the little old ladies walking down the street no longer are afraid because there aren't druggies hanging around outside the block and what have you. But I think it's much more ideological than that. And it's much more of a, it's not about what you see on the street. There's a big illusion that people only respond to what they see in front of them. Not true. I mean, nationalism would make no sense if that were the case. People respond to big abstractions. They like that stuff. And the big abstraction in this case was Duterte said, look, this is our economic uplift. If we get rid of the corrupt, and corrupt was a good metaphor for everybody they had it in for, not just the drug users, they were just the worst, but also corrupt businessmen, corrupt politicians, corrupt journalists who ask difficult questions. If we get rid of the corruption, then the prosperity will improve, businesses will come in, and you will experience economic uplift. So this was death squad populism. This was death squad populism as economic uplift, and people supported it. So we need to take very seriously the productive, not in a good sense, but productive and constructive role of violence within the framework of a competitive electoral democracy, albeit one that's being pushed to the right and an authoritarian and counter-democratic direction.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Richard, I know, of course, we have listeners, you can buy Disaster Nationalism now from Verso. And I know, of course, there's a new edition of the Twittering Machine just out with Indigo of a new foreword, I believe. And of course, listeners, of course, can also find Richard's work over at Salvage, where he's a founder, one of the editors. And you're also a regular appearer on our good friends over at Politics Fury Other. But do you have anything else in the pipeline at the moment? Where else can people find you?
Well, I think it's very important that people should come over to my Patreon and subscribe, because I am desperately poor and need money. And I can assure you I need it more than you do. So come and subscribe for £1 or £2 or £3. So you can find me there. And also, I suppose I'm working on a few other books, which you'll get to hear about. And yeah, generally you can find me hypocritically sort of whining on social media. So if you really must, you can track me down there.
Yeah, we'll drop all the links in the show notes. But Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Thanks. Good talking to you.